So tonight we're going to talk about transfer, a dirty word. And we're going to do that in a place called Birim, which is in the Galil. And if you want to go there ever, there's a beautiful ancient synagogue there that's worth looking at, which we're not going to talk at all about tonight, because we're going to talk about transfer in the way probably that you thought I was going to do, which is transfer of the Arab population. The first ideas of transfer, however, were not Israeli, but they were very, very British. We talked about this, I think, last week, that in 1936 and 1937, Lord Peel came and there was a royal commission which first looked at the ideas of partitioning up Palestine between the Arabs and the Jews. And what they came up with was the plan that you see in the map, where the Jews would get the coastal strip and they would get all of the Galil. And the Arabs would get, obviously, all of the West Bank, and they would get all of the desert as well. And the green sausage in the middle was an area that the British intended to leave for themselves. So Jerusalem would stay administered by the British, and they would have a corridor which would allow them access from the sea. Not only did they propose a division of the land, but also in the official documents, it says like this. It says, if
you faded out for me. Oh.
Okay, it's just, I think it's an internet problem. Hopefully I'm back. Yeah, I've got a message, my internet is unstable. Oh dear. Okay, hopefully you can hear me now. It says, if partition is to be effective in promoting a final settlement, it must mean more than drawing a frontier and establishing two states. Sooner or later, there should be transfer of land and, as far as possible, an exchange of population. And when they talked about exchange of population, it wasn't such a problem for Jews in the Arab areas, because there was only 1,250 of those, but there were 225,000 Arabs that were in those areas that were designated to be the Jewish state, particularly Arabs that were located in the Galil. And the British wrote, if as a result it is clear that a substantial amount of land could be made available for resettlement of Arabs living in the Jewish area, the most strenuous effort should be made to obtain an agreement for transfer of land and population. So the British acknowledged very early on that if this partition plan was going to work, they were going to have to transfer Arabs out of the Jewish land. And perhaps this was one of the reasons why David Ben-Gurion and the Yishuv accepted the partition plan. They did not accept the borders, but they accepted this as a framework that would be acceptable in drawing up a future withdrawal, basically the British pulling out and leaving Palestine to be divided up between Jews and Arabs. Of course, the Arabs categorically rejected the plan. So we're going to go forward 7 years after the Second World War to the 29th of November 1947, and this was the date that the United Nations agreed to partition Palestine, and this and provide a framework for the British pulling out. And now the map had slightly changed. So what was proposed, if you look at again, the West Bank, of course, went to the Arabs, but the Galil now was divided up between the Arabs and the Jews, with the Jews getting the eastern portion around Lake Tiberias, and the western portion, which included, for example, Akko, being left in Arab hands. In this case, the Negev that we saw in 1937 was proposed to be part of the Arab state. The Negev this time was part of the area that would be given to the Jews. Obviously, that was the signal, the 29th of November 1947, for a civil war to break out. On the 14th of May 1948, Israel declared its independence. And this is what it wrote in the Declaration of Independence that was declared in Tel Aviv regarding borders. In the 14th paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, it was stated, the state of Israel is prepared to cooperate with the agencies and representatives of the United Nations in implementing the resolution of the General Assembly of the 29th of November 1947. And that is it. Nothing more was said about borders. So the Yishuv divided up between the groups on the left which were in favor of incorporating into the Declaration of Independence the borders that were drawn up by the United Nations. And on the other side of the fence, the Jabotinskyites, the revisionists, wanted to include in the Declaration of Independence that Israel should include the whole of the British Mandate. That is all the areas that we now know as Israel, the West Bank, and even the areas of the British Mandate that were allocated in 1922 to the state of Transjordan. Ben Gurion, and as usually happened, he got his way. He proposed a middle way. He said as follows: we accepted the UN resolution, but the Arabs did not. They are preparing to make war on us. If we defeat them and capture Western Galilee or territory on both sides of the road to Jerusalem, these areas will become part of the state. Why should we obligate ourselves to accept boundaries that in any case the Arabs don't accept? So the Arabs don't accept us, they don't accept any areas of partition, and basically what he was saying was, if we make gains in the War of Independence, we are going to keep those lands. And those actions, in one way or another, led to the infamous number of 700,000 Palestinian refugees, which has now become 7 million. Now, we can all argue about how those refugees came about, whether they were promised by the Arabs that once the Jews were all murdered, they would get their lands, whether we encouraged them to leave. We can argue about that. In truth, it's all of those things. It's a combination of them. And the number of refugees, as I mentioned, 700,000. They were Arabs that were that left or were pushed out of their houses in the 1948 war and fled or moved to the West Bank, to Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. In some cases, they moved to other places in Israel, or even a very small number moved to Iraq. Obviously, this doesn't include, for example, the Arabs that were located, for example, in eastern Jerusalem. Before the war, there were 600,000 Jews facing off against 1.2 million Arabs. By the end of the war, nearly all of the Arabs, I think there were about 100,000 Arabs that were left in the areas that had become Israel. For example, the eastern Jerusalem was no longer part of Israel. It had become part of Jordan. So that number, in addition to all these, those Arabs stayed in their houses, but it was no longer part of Israel. One of the operations was an operation called Operation Hiram that took place in the later stages of the war, in October 29th to the 31st. It was only 2 days. And basically this operation was designed to create a security area on the Lebanese border. And I'm finally getting to the point, actually. And I wanted to talk, because I said, remember a long time ago, I said we were in Biram or Biram, and there were 700 Maronite Christian inhabitants that Tzahal rolled up. It said to them, okay, we're going to push you out over the other side of the border to Lebanon. Once this security area on the Israel-Lebanon border has been established, you'll be able to come back to your houses. There was another village called Iqrit, that there were 500 also Christian inhabitants, and instead of being moved over the border, in that case they were moved to an area called Jish, which I think is in Gush Chalav, somewhere in between Akko and Sfat. You see a couple of pictures here. And what happened was, the inhabitants were moved over the border. The operation succeeded. Sometime in early 1949, a ceasefire, not any kind of peace treaty, but a ceasefire was signed between Israel and Lebanon, and the inhabitants were not allowed to come back to their villages. And in fact, I think there was a military government in the Galil right up to 1966. Despite that, the inhabitants decided that they would go to the Israel Supreme Court and they would make a petition to the court to be allowed to go back to their lands. In 1951, 5 inhabitants of Iqrit petitioned the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that because the land was not abandoned, that they should be allowed to go back to their land. But before they could go back, Iqrit was blown up by the IDF on Christmas Day. A very similar thing happened in Biram. In Biram, a petition was made to the Supreme Court in 1953, and similarly in 1953, the whole of Biram was blown up by the IDF, and in both villages, the only thing that was left was the church. And in 1955, an appropriation of land was made both in Biram and in Iqrit. The land was used, was given over to kibbutzim, and in Biram also, as I mentioned before, there's a very nice synagogue and a shmurat teva there. So the struggle of the original inhabitants and their descendants did not go away in the 1950s. And they continued to fight for their rights to go back to their villages. In 1972, Golda Meir, she was pretty blunt, and she said, it's not only consideration of security that prevents an official decision regarding Biram and Iqrit, but the desire to set a precedent. We cannot allow ourselves to become more and more entangled and to reach a point from which we are able to extricate ourselves. The point being that if we allow Christian refugees to go back to their villages, then that will open up a Pandora's box whereby the 700,000 Palestinian Muslims will also want to come back, the 700, as I mentioned before, no longer being 700, but being 7 million. Menachem Begin in 1977, he promised he would work for the return to Iqrit and Biram, but it never happened. And Yitzhak Rabin, 1 year before he was assassinated, he actually set up a committee. I think at that time the Arabs were, not sure if the Arab parties were in the government, or certainly they were supporting the government to get Talich Oslo through. Yitzhak Rabin set up a committee to study the problem, and the committee concluded the villagers had the right to return, and the government was duty-bound to assist them in doing so. And in 1998, and we're already in the period of Netanyahu's first prime ministership, and Tzachya Negbi, who was the justice minister, he said no obstacle should be placed in the way of the return of the evacuees in the spirit of Libai and Klugman, which was that committee, and which provide a step forward and strong basis for negotiation. But of course, nothing happened. And I just wanted to, my favorite publication, which I love reading every day because it's completely unbiased. This comes from Haaretz in 2013 and comes from an article that was written there. And the article goes as follows. It said, I've taken bits out of it. Over the years, numerous appeals to the Supreme Court, government inquiries, commissions, demonstrations and protests have produced no results. The promise is still broken and justice has not been served. The inhabitants of Biram and Iqrit are still waiting. Another part of the same article, it was the unilateral withdrawal of the IDF from southern Lebanon without adequate coordination with the SLA, with the Southern Lebanon Army, or Sadal, which added the shame of betrayal of an ally who had fought alongside the soldiers of the IDF for years to the broken promise to the villagers of Biram and Iqrit. Basically, the writer of this article saying that we treated Sadal, we treated the soldiers there particularly badly. We left them to Hezbollah, or they had to flee to Europe, or in some cases, some of them came to Israel as well. And we've abandoned our Christian allies in Lebanon like we abandoned our Christian allies in Biram and Iqrit. How to explain this treatment of loyal allies to the state of Israel? Is this a deliberate policy of the Israeli government towards its Christian friends? And the person that wrote that article in Haaretz was Moshe Ahrens, who was defense minister under various Likud governments and sadly passed away last year. And that's it, only to say that unfortunately, this is my take on it, obviously can interpret it how you want. Unfortunately, in wars, innocent people get wronged and get hurt, as we know only too well. And you're all now